So today, I'm here to talk a little bit about the drivers of injustice in the context of urban sustainability. But first, I wanted to quickly introduce a little bit the Barcelona lab and the work that we do there. A lot of the research and the insights that I'm going to share today are based on kind of collective work and reflection together with Isabelle and other colleagues at the lab. So we're working on a broad variety of themes, but I guess what connects them all is this focus on critically assessing what are the motivations behind urban sustainability initiatives, including greening, and what are their effects. One of which is green gentrification that Isabelle will be focusing more in the second part of this webinar, but also analyzing patterns of environmental and health inequalities that are embedded in urbanization processes, and identifying how broader processes of global scale, political and economic forces impact and shape what happens at the local level and in the urban environment. So I wanted to also encourage you to take a look at some of the audiovisual and interactive material that we've produced and that you can find in the website, because I think they really give a very kind of firsthand and vivid narrations of these kind of complex and complex realities and complex stories of injustice in the city. So we've produced some mini documentaries on some of the cases of social environmental struggle and injustice in Barcelona in this short documentary, To Green or Not to Green, which then turned into a wider effort to map urban justice struggles in the city of Barcelona. So then we have started to put together a map with different cases of different neighborhoods, each of which has a short description or a short video that we've produced together with activists and grassroots organizations. So the map is not launched yet, but the videos are accessible and you can browse through it if you're interested in our website. And last but not least, we have a kind of a more broader, geographically broader interactive web documentary, The Green Divide, which explores green inequalities across 6 cities in Europe, United States, and Canada. And with this, let's start talking about justice in cities and environmental justice, climate justice, sustainability justice. I didn't know how to start this topic because it's such a big and central question in a lot of philosophical debates and political and scholarly discussions. So I was recently kind of reminded of this quote from Cornel West. Cornel West is an African-American writer, activist, and academic who said that justice is what care looks like in public. And I was reminded of that by another scholar, Seye Ambimbola, who's a health systems researcher and currently the Prince Claus Chair, the holder of in the Utrecht University, who said and added to that justice is not an outcome. It is a process. It's a moving target. So our responsibility is to continuously craft rules to promote justice through a continuous activity, or I would call it a continuous struggle. So inspired by these and so many other scholars who speak of social and environmental justice and those who have brought these insights into the urban context, you know, there's a huge list of names. I'm not going to start name dropping now, but I think we can approach justice for the sake of this webinar with this kind of more basic definition of justice being a set of conditions which are concerned with the distribution of resources, but also with social recognition and with the political process, the political stage, conditions which allow for full human flourishing. And this full human flourishing, you know, can be approached as a set of achievable outcomes that individuals and groups value themselves in order to live a healthy and fulfilling life. So if the conditions within a given society systematically support some but hinder others in achieving such basic flourishing, then that society is to some degree unjust. So what drives injustice in the context of urban sustainability? First, I wanted to shortly comment on some of sustainability's own inner contradictions, which then relate to this question of what drives injustice. Urban sustainability obviously hinges on this larger concept of sustainable development, which has been interpreted in different ways, is arguably, very loosely defined, and has been criticized for being an oxymoron and a powerful discourse that sometimes does more harm than good. So urban sustainability is supposed to have these three dimensions, right? The economic, the environmental, and the social dimension, which the social dimension has usually been framed in terms of equity or justice. However, as Pearson and Pierce, authors of this article, I can share the link later, have said, justice is often the short leg in the sustainability stool in public policy. It is named, but is not fully explored or addressed. So urban sustainability can be really contradicting in itself when it seeks to address or counteract environmental degradation, but does not question the complex systems that sustain this kind of degradation and injustice, systems of capitalism, colonialism, racism, heteropatriarchy, systems which are built on oppressions and unequal relations of power. So if sustainable development and urban sustainability does not question those systems, how will it ever promote social, environmental, or climate justice? In the urban context, we see that in the last decades, cities seem to be following what has been called an orthodoxy for new, green, resilient, and smart sustainable cities, which seeks to achieve these win-win solutions for both environmentalism and growth in liberal economies. And I think this is where these two contradictions arise, the ecological economic, some of which Flor pointed to in her introduction, and the ecological economic equity contradiction. So the first one is about how continuous growth and climate change mitigation are hardly compatible. And colleagues in ecological economics and degrowth have been working on this issue for a long time. And thinking about this at the level of the cities are called to develop plans to address the impacts of climate change or to mitigate climate change, but they're also expected to be the main growth machines in global economies. At the same time, urbanization appears to be one of the main drivers of climate change. So cities find themselves in this framework of a socioeconomic system that demands continuous economic growth, while also are called to address climate change, which is largely a consequence of this socioeconomic system. I won't be touching more on this aspect, just to say that there's very intense environmental injustices taking place because of this contradiction, even if we don't encounter those in cities, but in other places, in extractive frontiers, in other countries and continents where materials and energy come from to be able to feed the social metabolism of cities. Then there is the equity deficit, what has been called the equity deficit in sustainability and in urban sustainability, where basically we can see it expressing in the unequal distribution of environmental goods and bads, things like toxic waste and pollution versus, health promoting amenities, parks, and other kinds of benefits that stem from sustainability initiatives. These are unequally distributed in cities, but this is only one way of looking at justice or injustice in cities, because this injustice can also be seen and expressed in the procedures of decision-making, in how different people and different groups are systematically marginalized from the public sphere, from processes of community making, and how the very vision of sustainability, sometimes, what is sustainable, green, and healthy city, what does that look like, can be something imposed on people, excluding values, opinions, experiences, and visions, alternative visions that often come from the most vulnerable residents, and so to invisibilize them. So we're talking about distributional justice, but we're also talking about procedural justice, recognition, and a whole other set of expressions or types of injustice that we can see emerging the deeper we look into the processes that lead to challenge this, what we were talking about in the beginning, challenge certain people into accessing or being able to be part of those conditions that will allow them to fully flourish, right? So we have identified 10 drivers of injustice that operate in processes of urban sustainability. And thank you, Carlota, who designed also these nice graphics to demonstrate some of those, to visualize some of those. And this is part of an ongoing work that we are building on and forms the basis of a new upcoming book, which will be titled Injustice in Urban Sustainability, 10 Core Drivers, will be out hopefully this time next year. So here I will talk in detail about a couple of them, because there's not enough time to touch on all of them, but I wanted to just highlight that the way we conceptualize these drivers is not as them operating completely independently from each other, but rather we see that in most of the empirical examples and case studies that we've studied, we see them working together, both synergistically and cyclically, in the sense that there's often more than one driver operating to produce injustice. And also one driver might lead into or might morph into another form of driver and cause different types of injustice as a case of conflict or a process of urban change, evolves in time. So these are not static and they're not completely independent from each other. So the one driver I wanted to touch upon today is the uneven and excluding urban intensification and regeneration. And this refers to the ways in which new urban developments force trade-offs between social and environmental goals in urban sustainability projects. So basically, this often involves efforts to improve a neighborhood, to change a neighborhood's physical structure, and are accompanied by this aim or objective to boost its economy by attracting investment, usually in the sectors of real estate and or tourism. So what happens is that land, housing, and open space, green space, compete with each other and get reconfigured in ways that negatively impact on vulnerable residents. And when I say vulnerable residents, I mean, I use this term a bit simplistically here, but obviously understanding that there's a lot of different types of vulnerability and intersectional vulnerabilities, identity-related vulnerabilities, socioeconomic vulnerabilities, etc. So if you want, we can discuss this later on, but I'll be referring to vulnerable residents as socioeconomically more vulnerable people, but also people who have been historically marginalized from what I said before, the public sphere, from political processes that have been historically oppressed, etc. So the example I want to talk about is the Ellinikon. I don't know how many of you have heard it, but Ellinikon used to be a big plot of land, was the airport of Athens before the new airport was built. And it was a public asset that, according to the conditions set for Greece's financial bailout in 2010, it had to be privatized and exploited in order to create new investment environments. Back in 1995, there was legislation that this plot would be a metropolitan green zone to compensate for the historical lack of green spaces in Athens. But as political processes evolved, it morphed into a kind of investment property and opportunity for great developments, mostly targeting elite buyers and upper class consumers. So what is in the plans now, it hasn't been built yet. These are like pictures of what this would look like, is, a casino, 3, 4-star, 5-star hotels, elite villas, and this kind of infrastructure, malls, like shopping malls. And the green park that is supposed to be accessible has been drastically reduced. And it's not even clear what kind of access this will be, with the surrounding completely privatized and, privately guarded infrastructures, how really welcoming and accessible this will be to the average Athenian citizen. But also it's problematic that the maintenance and management of this park will be assigned to private entities, not to municipal authorities, which usually manage public parks. So there are a lot of questions that arise over, how will behavior, policing, surveillance will be governed in this park. And it falls into a kind of a pseudo public sphere. So when we look at this from an environmental justice lens, it falls into the classic category of brownfield redevelopment and greening that, however, fails to address the past inequities of chronic lack of green space, because the possibility of it being a huge green park is drastically reduced. The accessibility of that park is highly questioned. And also there has been zero public dialogue about it, where the plan for the construction was approved within 2 weeks in the middle of August, basically eradicating any chance for like meaningful public dialogue about this new development. So obviously procedural and recognition aspects of justice are being compromised here in the case of Ellinikon, a case which is ongoing, by the way. The other driver that I want to talk about, and I think I have a little bit more time, right?
We have a couple of minutes left before we move to the breakout room, so.
Okay, I will maybe leave the example out, but I wanted to talk briefly about this limited citizen participation in urban planning, because I think it's very pertinent and of interest to many people who work on urban sustainability. A lot of people struggle to achieve participation or some level of participation, but we see that there's really, it can really be something, participation can really be something tokenistic, in the sense that not any kind of process that involves different types or numbers of people coming together and discussing is necessarily going to enhance justice in the process of urban sustainability planning. And this is because even when participatory channels exist, participation does not take place on equal grounds, meaning it is often characterized by the same power dynamics that it's supposedly aiming to address. This is for many reasons. Language used might be intimidating, the terms and the vocabulary, but also the language that is being used might be exclusive, especially when we're talking about very diverse neighborhoods or cities. So it might be intimidating for people who don't see themselves represented in this process, but also because when the outcomes of participation end up not being taken into account, when it's time to formulate policy, people get, demotivated because they've lost trust to the institutions that are supposed to take up their opinions and taking them into account. But what's interesting is that even in sustainability initiatives that are not government-led but are more bottom-up, the issue of participation is also can also be problematic, because the opportunity to dedicate time and energy into, let's say, a grassroots sustainability initiative is something that some people cannot afford. They cannot afford to pay into these kind of bottom-up projects because they can't dedicate time away from their work or their dependents, or they don't feel welcomed and represented. Again, this might be a question of race, it can be a question of age, it can be a question of education level, it can be a language issue, and many others. Interestingly, we find, for example, that what counts as participation is also worth considering, right? So findings from a project called Agapi showed that those most vulnerable to displacement due to urban gentrification processes were the ones that were the most excluded from the decision-making process that led to gentrification in the first place. So this is an important illustration of how distributive and procedural justice and their drivers can intersect to create exclusion. And so what I wanted to highlight here is that, interestingly, those people who were mostly involved in the fight for social justice and anti-gentrification were the most affected. And despite their vulnerability, they were the ones more mobilized. So it's worth reflecting on this kind of participation to the struggle for social and environmental justice, and how to better support that kind of participation as well. I was going to talk about an example from Barcelona, but I don't have time now. So if you want, we can maybe open it up in the discussion. But you can find more information on these drivers in the Urbana Wiki, like Flor said. And we have short videos for each of those and short descriptions with examples. So I welcome you all to take a look. Thank you.